silver one?
Afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming out. I'm sure you're all familiar with the music of Geoffrey Keezer. I mean, you really did have an early start, and if I recall, your family had a lot to do with that, right?
Yeah, I was the only child of two music teachers. My dad is a jazz drummer, and my mother is retired now, but she played French horn, classical French horn, and taught piano and voice at home. So I was just around. I just thought that's what everybody did, you know. People would come over to the house, and I'd be like, "What do you play? You know, what instrument do you play?"
So you had a drummer, you had a horn player, but you became a piano player. How did that happen?
I started out as a drummer and kind of emulating my dad, and then kind of gravitated to piano because I liked to write my own music and kind of compose, and then started working in my dad's band when I was 15 and playing jazz gigs, and grew up in Wisconsin, so you play weddings and polkas. We played a lot of polkas. You know, we'd play Giant Steps as a polka, or we'd play Beatles tunes as a polka, or you know, just anything. And piano just it made sense for me to be the piano player, so that's kind of how that happened.
Did you ever play accordion?
I never did. I still would like to learn. It's a really cool instrument. I just don't know how to do it.
So
the buttons anyway. I could do the keys.
I take it the jazz you gravitated to was consistent with what your parents were listening to?
I do remember. I remember coming home one day and I just bought a reissue of Kind of Blue, you know, in the record store. When I grew up in an era when record stores still existed, and I came home with Kind of Blue, and I said, "Dad, you've got to check this record out. This is so awesome. Listen to this." He's like, "Yeah, I had it the first time around." And then he said, "Yeah, you know, when we were 19 and 20, we were all, you know, trying to figure out what Bill Evans was doing on the record, and you know, so I was listening to a lot of the same things that he heard growing up."
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, did you go to jazz camps in the summer?
I did. I went to Jamie Aebersold camp. I went to a camp in northern Wisconsin in a place called Shell Lake that my dad taught at. And I was there, you know, growing up in that camp. It went for 3 weeks every summer. And that was just the environment I grew up in.
Meet any future colleagues?
I'm trying to think. I know that Lyle Mays babysat me once. That's the only time I've ever met him. I've actually never crossed paths with him as an adult.
I ask this because I want to talk to you about someone who I consider a mentor of yours, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, James Williams.
Yeah.
And one of his gigs in Boston, Pat Metheny was in the audience. I said, "Oh, Pat, it's great to see you here." And he said, "Oh, yeah, James and I went to camp together." You know?
Yeah.
So
yeah.
There's a lot of that actually goes on, given the way jazz education has grown and been structured. But I want to ask about James, because he's the person who kind of first said to me, "There's this young kid from Wisconsin. He's unbelievable. He's going to be in Boston. You got to hear him play." So how did you and James connect?
I met James Williams because, for those of you who don't know, he's a pianist. He was the pianist and musical director with Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers in the kind of the late 70s, and became more or less like a mentor of mine. I met him, and they used to have this organization called the International Association of Jazz Educators, or IAJE, and I met him at one of those conferences when I was 15 years old. I'd won a little contest where I got to be one of the young talent, you know, musicians, and we flew down to Atlanta, and I just started really getting into jazz, so I was collecting a lot of albums, and I had bought a couple of James's records at the mall in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, and I had his record, so I recognized him right away, and I was, "Oh my God, this is," you know, it was like being a kid in a candy store. I mean, I looked at there, Dizzy Gillespie was there, and Donald Harrison was there, and Terrence Blanchard, and I don't know, Steve Turre, and all kinds of just people that I was listening to and really studying and really into. So I asked him for a lesson. That's what you do, you know, and we found a piano somewhere in a room at like 2 o'clock in the morning, and he sat me down and told me about Phineas Newborn Jr., pianist, about Hank Jones, about, you know, some pianists that I wasn't really aware of yet, and we started corresponding, and I had a band at home with my friends. Most of my friends were older. I was in high school, and most of my buddies were in college. The friends that played instruments, so we had a band, and we were trying to play all those songs by Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers, and what, you know, like what Wynton Marsalis was doing at the time, and just those kind of the things like in the mid-'80s that were happening. And I remember sending cassette tapes of my original music. I'd get my friends together and we'd record my tunes, and I sent it to James. And over a few years, we corresponded back and forth. And then when I was getting ready to go to Berkeley in Boston, James was recording for a label called Sunnyside, Francois Alican. And he approached Francois, and he said, "There's this young kid in Wisconsin that is writing some really cool music, and you should, let me produce a record by him." So I actually made my first album, which was actually on vinyl, in 1989, and James produced that record and then my next 3 albums. And he introduced me to Art Blakey. He took me up to McKell's in New York, a club that used to be on, I think it was on Central Park West or somewhere. Mm-hmm. And my sort of induction into Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers was one of those real kind of law of attraction kind of things, because I'd already been playing Art's music for 3 years with my band, so I knew Blakey's music inside and out, and that was my dream, to be in that band. And when I met James and introduced me to Art, and then also Billy Pierce, the saxophonist that played in the same edition of the Messengers as James did, when I got to Berkeley, Billy Pierce was a faculty member at Berkeley, and he still is, yeah. And I joined Billy Pierce's Art Blakey ensemble at Berkeley, which rehearsed right next door to the Iron Maiden heavy metal ensemble. So it was a battle of volume, The walls are very thin, there. So I knew all that music, and so when I actually got introduced properly to Art Blakey, and he just invited me to sit in, he's like, "Come up and play." So we played, we played Monin and Mayray and some of those classic Blakey tunes. And then I had another opportunity to sit in. Benny Green was the pianist at the time. And I had another opportunity to sit in Boston when Art came to the Regatta Bar. And Benny was very gracious and let me play a couple tunes with the band. And this was before the era of having to worry about identity theft or any of that kind of stuff. So I remember sitting sort of along, there's some chairs like that along the side of the room, and the cheap seats, and Art Blakey walks over to me after I sat in, and he goes, "Give me your passport and social security number." Everyone that played with Art Blakey does an impersonation of his voice, a very gravelly voice, And I said, "What? Huh?" He's like, "You're going to be on Jazz Messengers soon. I need your info." I'm like, "Okay, I don't know." And then I moved to New York that fall after spending a year at Berkeley with a buddy of mine who just needed a roommate. He said, "You're coming with me to New York." So we moved to New York, and within a week of moving there, somehow Art's tour manager tracked me down and got my number and called me up and hired me for the band. So it was mind-boggling, but at the same time, it really just felt natural. It was like, well, this is what I've always wanted to do, and this is just where I should be. But, with that came a bit of, I think I was a little arrogant, too, at the time, kind of like, well, everyone should know who I am now, Please.
And that was the edition with Brian Lynch and Steve Davis?
Well, Frank Lacey was the trombonist, okay. and when I joined the band, and Donald Harrison was in the band for the second time. He had returned. Right. And Javon Jackson and Esiet on bass, and then we went through a couple of personnel changes, Steve Davis, and a few things. But it was the last year of the band, and I just feel so lucky that I made it in there,
Yeah, I think people often talk about one of the great losses in jazz is these band leaders who would really mentor. And I think Blakey, the story always was that he'd basically bring you to a point where you'd say, "Okay, now you go out and lead your own band. You've been a sideman long enough." And he'd encourage you to write music and
he did. He always wanted us to bring music in, and he would sort of ambush us. He'd said, he called me up, and I think it was like a Tuesday, and he said, "We're making a record on Thursday." I'm like, "We are?" I said, "Well, what are we going to play?" He's like, "I don't know. You got some tunes, don't you?" So everybody in the band stayed up all night writing music for this record.
And of
It's very
course,
spontaneous. He lived his life in the moment, you know.
and talk about how he would learn the music because he didn't read music.
He didn't read music, but he had an amazing photographic memory for music, and he would just listen to the band. We would rehearse the songs, and he would just listen to us play it once, and then he would have it. And Billy Higgins was the same way. And I remember we would usually do a trio feature somewhere in the show, and as the gig went on, and Art would take longer and longer breaks, and sometimes when we were playing Sweet Basil, and he lived in the Greenwich Village right around the corner, I swear he would just go home, you know, and come back. But so we would, you know, I would play solo tunes, and I always say that Art taught me how to play solo piano just by making me do it, just forcing me to do it. But we're talking about his memory. One time I had learned, there's a song called Our Delight by Tad Dameron that Art Blakey recorded like in the 40s with Fats Navarro, and there's a very specific arrangement to the song and something we call a shout chorus, which is like an arranged section with, you know, not the melody of the tune, but like another variation or arranged section of the piece with all kinds of hits and complicated rhythms and things. And I played it one night just for fun, and he played it like he had just recorded it 5 minutes ago, you know, and it was 50 years ago or something. So.
Did you find when you wrote for that band that you were writing pieces with holes for Art Blakey? Because so much of the music that came out of that band, part of the identity of the music is the drum fills and the little things that he would do.
Yeah, well, you would write to the style of the band. You know, you try to write something that would be not too complicated. You know, something he could pick up fairly quickly and would sound good with his style of drumming, which was very, very forceful, and very, very loud, but it never got in the way, you know? It was just really, really strong. He had such a strong beat, and I can still, like when I play swing, like when you hear my trio play tonight and we play a straight ahead swing tune, I still feel Art Blakey, you know? I still feel that beat. It's like permanently stitched into my DNA somehow.
Well, you know, another master who you got to play with under to sort of complete the rhythm section was Ray Brown.
Ray Brown, yeah.
And maybe that was later in your career, but compare and contrast, if you will.
Yeah, Ray Brown, he was a little bit easier to communicate with just as a person, you know. And he very much treated the guys in his band like peers, you know. He was really, really nice guy, and I felt like he really took good care of us and really looked out for us. I played in his band for 3 years, and you know, Ray also had a very kind of conservative, traditional sort of view of playing trio, you know, contrasting with like, I don't know, the way Keith Jarrett's trio plays or Brad Meldon.
Well,
or
it's
something
very
like that.
arranged.
Yeah, very. It's kind of, Ray really liked that big band sound, so he wanted things to sound kind of like a big band, and you know, I was sort of rebelling, you know, and wanting to stretch the boundaries as far as I could, you know, harmonically or just playing as weird as I could, and he just went right along with it. Like you couldn't stump him, you know. If I started playing really outside of the chords or whatever, he would just go right along with me, because I knew that I gave him enough of what he wanted, and that he would be happy, and it was fantastic. I still think it's the best thing that ever happened to my piano playing, because we were playing every night. I mean, we would play 300 nights a year, you know, continually. It was great.
There's always a question in my mind. Blakey and Ray Brown, they're very strong personalities, but they play their way. Mm-hmm. And, you know, talking about wanting to stretch and go out as a young musician, you must come up against a wall at certain times.
Well, the only time he ever really said anything, we were playing the song Tin Tin Deo by Dizzy Gillespie, and immediately at the beginning of my solo, I launched into the Imperial March, you know, dun 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 dun, and he just leaned over and he said, "Jazz, please." You know? It's the only criticism I ever got.
You talked about Phineas Newborn. You were like the honorary Memphian in the contemporary piano ensemble, and that was an incredible collection of musicians. I have to say, I was at a jazz festival once in Perugia
Oh yeah.
at the Umbria Jazz Fest, and I walked into the area where people ate dinner one night. There's the Contemporary Piano Ensemble, which is Jeff, James Williams, Mulgrew Miller, Donald Brown, and Harold Mayburn. And then at another table was Keith Jarrett, and at another table was Herbie Hancock. And
Yeah.
I said, is this piano heaven I've wandered into? but that was an incredible group, and you were sort of the honorary non-Tennessean in there, weren't you?
Yeah, all those guys were all from Memphis or nearby, and all came up in that scene. And because of becoming friends with James Williams, I met Mulgrew and Harold Mayburn and Donald Brown, and they kind of adopted me into their little circle. And then I read for years, in reviews or in articles that I was from Memphis, by association.
Did you ever meet Newborn, or was he?
I never did. No,
Okay.
he passed away before I really had a chance.
Talk about the challenges of playing with other piano players, because that's a very unusual situation, and two piano is challenging enough, I would think, but sometimes it really swelled, didn't it?
Yeah, we had 4, so that's a whole lot of keys. You just have to kind of, it's like having a conversation with, sitting at a table with 4 or 5 people. I mean, you just try to leave space for people to play. And there were sections that were orchestrated where we'd all be playing together, but if we were, we'd try to play in different registers of the piano, so it wasn't all just a big mess all the time. But sometimes it was a big mess. Can't win them all, But it was a cool idea. That was James Williams' idea, And we actually did a tour in the early 90s where we put 4 pianos, 4 Yamaha pianos on a truck every night and drove around with them. We did 20 dates like that. Can you imagine doing that now? I mean, we were like the Dave Matthews Band. I mean, it was amazing. Gear,
In the midst of all these, call them prestige gigs, playing with Blakey and Ray Brown and these other great piano players, how does a young musician carve out their own thing amidst all that?
Yeah, well, that's one of the things that's been kind of challenging for me, I think, career-wise, and it's why I've been focusing mainly on playing solo piano lately. My new record is called Heart of the Piano, and it's a solo record. And I feel like that's one area where I can do something really unique and really my own voice. I've always loved to play bass lines with my left hand, and I kind of like to play everything all at once. So that's a lot of fun for me. So tonight at the concert, I'm going to start with a few solo tunes from the new record, and then I'll bring the guys up. But I've also been interested in a lot of different things. I never really had one thing that I wanted to do. Like, for example, like maybe someone like Brad Meldau started out, he said, I'm going to do trio, and he had established that brand and that identity. So whenever you see him play, unless he's doing a special project, you're going to get the Brad Meldau trio, and that's a great brand, and it's fantastic music, and he's one of my favorite pianists. For me, I'm so scatterbrained, and I've always wanted to do a lot of different things, and I love collaborating with people. The last maybe 10 years of my career has been focused mostly on collaborations with other musicians of different genres, people like Kayla Beamer, the Hawaiian slack key guitarist, or the project I did with the Peruvian musicians called Aurea that got nominated for the Best Latin Jazz Album Grammy. John Weekend, actually, our drummer, is on that record. And we're going to play some music from that tonight. And an Okinawan traditional singer named Yasukatsu Oshima. And I've just done all kinds of crazy stuff because just for me, when I'm interested in so many different kinds of music and genuinely love it. And so whenever I hear something I like, I can't leave well enough alone. I have to find a way to call them up and say, you want to make a record together? So that happens a lot. Yes, I think, but lately I've been mainly focusing on playing solo because first of all, it's low overhead. It's easy to tour. One flight, one hotel room,
And the same crapshoot about the quality of the instrument, whether you got a band or you're by yourself.
This is a lovely piano. As soon as I sat down this afternoon, I went, thank you, Well, thank you to Burlington Jazz Festival for having this. But yeah, it's,
Well, go off on a tangent for a minute. Tell us your worst piano story you ever encountered.
Ooh.
Or one of. There are probably too many to.
I have to say that the level of pianos has gotten a lot better over the years. I mean, you used to go into clubs. Sometimes they'd have some pretty awful instruments in there, but in general, the pianos have gotten much better over the years. So I don't really have any complaints.
Now, this interest in other musical cultures. Could you have seen yourself recording with Peruvians and Filipinos and people from all over the world when you were a jazz messenger, or was there a point in your development where this became a passion of yours?
I think somewhere in my mid-20s, I started really listening to a lot of different kinds of music and just became interested in a lot of different things. And my heart is always going to be jazz is always home base for me. It's just where I resonate, and it's how I feel like I can express my humanity most, in the most authentic way possible. But I love music from all over the world and all kinds of styles, and it's fun to play.
You say you're focusing on trio, on solo now, but I wonder where trio fits in your scheme of things. There's a tradition of the piano trio.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if there's any personal urge or pressure from elsewhere to uphold it, or where does it fit in your routine these days?
I do it maybe once a year or something. It's a lot of fun. Sometimes I have to adjust a little bit because I'm kind of used to playing all the parts myself. So tonight, like for example, when we were rehearsing this afternoon, I went, oh, wait, I don't have to play that part now. I can just let the bassist do that. And that frees me up to do something else. So it's just a little bit of an adjustment, but it's a lot of fun. And it's fun playing with people. I mean, you can feed off each other's energy, and you don't have to, you don't have to provide all of the energy yourself,
Do you write differently when you know you're going to be playing solo versus playing with a group?
Maybe. We've adapted a couple of the tunes off my solo record for the trio tonight, so you get a chance to hear it.
Now, you're also very in demand as an accompanist, I know, and you work with Dianne Reeves, I think, and Chris Botti.
Yeah.
How much freedom do you have in gigs like that to express yourself?
That's a good question. It varies. I mean, for example, Chris Botti's gig, that's probably my main job at the moment, and his show is, if you've ever seen him, it's a really fun show, and it's a really wide variety. It's almost like a variety show. I mean, he's got some straight-ahead jazz. He plays pop or classical pops. He's got an opera singer in the band. He's got a classical violinist, but he also has like heavy-duty jazz musicians like Billy Kilson and Richie Goods on bass, and it's a fun show to do. So in the course of the night, I'll be playing everything from really feeling like a jazz musician to playing like real pop kind of piano, almost like David Foster kind of stuff, which is fine. Anytime as a sideman that I'm required or asked to play something that's a little bit outside of my comfort zone, or something I'm not familiar with, I just look at it as like a challenge. I'm like, oh, goody, So I go to iTunes. Chris will ask for the most outlandish stuff sometimes. Like, can you play the piano part like on the Chicago, whatever song, I'm like, okay, I don't know that tune, but I'm gonna go check it out, and I'll learn it. And it's always made me a better musician. I don't feel like my studying music outside of jazz in any way takes away from my abilities as a jazz musician. I think it only makes me a better musician in general. And Dianne Reeves, of course, playing with Dianne Reeves, she's obviously one of our greatest living vocalists, but she's really in the band too. You feel like she's a horn player, like it's like playing with Coltrane or something. She's that strong, and it's super, super fun.
So I want to ask you something about, is it Botti, Chris Botti?
Botti, yeah.
As I've never seen him perform, but he took a blindfold test in Downbeat a few years ago.
Oh, yeah?
And he's nailing Booker Little.
Oh,
and,
yeah.
You know, and I say, did this guy stay up for 2 weeks to study this, or does he really know all these trumpet
He
players?
knows that stuff. I mean, if you hear him warming up backstage, he's shedding Clifford Brown solos and all that stuff. So he knows his vocabulary. Yeah.
I think we're going to open it up to some questions from all of you. And as I always say, the first one is the hardest. Should have brought my dental tools so I can pull the first one out. Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, so you were talking earlier about our Blakey and how he would ask you to come in with songs and whatever. And I was wondering, he always or often had an artistic director in each of the groups.
Oh, yeah.
You know, Walter Davis Jr.
Sure,
or
yeah.
Bobby Watson, whatever. Did you have one in your group, and did you have the opportunity to sort of, see how he goes through the process of deciding, what he wanted in that regard?
We kind of did, but I think by the time I got in his band, I think things were fairly disorganized. So we maybe rehearsed once ever as a band, and Art didn't show up for it. So we just kind of threw things together, Frank Lacey, our trombonist, was more or less the musical director, but it's pretty chaotic most of the time. Good question, though.
More questions? Yes.
Living in Burlington, Vermont, I'm fascinated by Canada as a source of wonderful jazz musicians. Can you talk a little bit about the guys you're going to play with tonight? Is Julia Fraser Hollins with you?
Fraser Hollins is the bassist. He drove down from Montreal. I met him playing in Montreal with Joel Miller, saxophonist, and he was brilliant. Blown away. So I thought, well, this is geographically close. This would be a good opportunity to bring him down and play. It's great hang too. Funny guy. I mean, that's part of it, right? Part of the reason you hire people for your band is, not just the music, the musicality and professionalism they bring, but they're guys that you want to go have a beer with after the show and laugh. We have a lot of fun.
Nobody else? Nobody?
Okay, bye.
Okay. I want to ask you about your teaching, because you do a lot of teaching online. Is this correct?
Yeah, I have a video series of video jazz piano lessons, and it's called creatively titled KeezersPianoLessons.com. But they're mostly 5 to 7 minute videos and on specific topics. They're not really entry-level stuff. It's more for pianists who are a bit more experienced, because there's so much free beginning jazz piano stuff on YouTube. I don't feel like I can compete with that necessarily by charging for it. But I teach stuff that's kind of interesting to me, or things that students have asked me over the years. I've sort of assembled a mental list of topics and things that I would teach to someone in a private lesson. I don't teach privately currently, but I'll try to put them in the videos, and they're like $5. I mean, for the price of a latte, you get information that'll last you a lifetime. And I also try with my lessons. They're not specific exercises. I mean, I try to teach things as like guidelines, or like try this, but try 20 other ways. So I try to empower students to kind of learn how to practice with the videos. So it's a little bit different approach.
I would think one challenge for a teacher is students coming and say, well, show me how to play like, Bill Evans, show me how to play like Brad Meldau,
Sure.
or Mulgrew Miller, or whoever.
Yeah. Well, there are specific things you can isolate, like say about Bill Evans. You could say he does these kind of, like. Those kind of sounds like in his left hand. So you can teach specific things that pianists do, or you can teach touch. Like McCoy Tyner's touch is different from Keith Jarrett's touch, or Bill Evans' touch, or Herbie's, or everyone has a different kind of sound and a different way that they actually touch. You could take this piano and put 4 different this is what we used to do with the piano ensemble. 4 of us would sit down at the same piano and play, and it would sound like 4 completely different instruments, And it has a lot to do with just the way you touch the instrument, and also the way that you just conceptualize a sound on the instrument, in your mind.
Which is very consistent. If anyone was here for the Benny Golson session, someone asked a question basically about what reed and mouthpiece, and
Right.
and he told a very interesting story about when he and Coltrane met Charlie Parker and pumped him for all that information. Ultimately, it didn't work for them when they went out and bought all these things.
Yeah.
But he said that your sound is in your head, basically.
Yeah.
And it's
interesting.
not about the mechanical things that you bring along with it.
It helps to have good gear, though. I think it really does. They're like power tools. If you're trying to build a house and you've got like crappy tools, it's just not going to work. So I think it's both. Having a really clear concept of how you want your instrument to sound, and then having a nice instrument to support you and back you up.
When you were starting, did you have models that you wanted to sound like?
When I was really first starting out, I think Chick Corea is a big hero of mine and a big influence, and thankfully he's become a friend over the years. And one thing about Chick, I always loved his touch on the piano, and I loved the way he as a composer, and his concept of music, was just so interesting and cool. And also career-wise, how he's done practically every year he has a different project, and he's just done a different thing. He's got so many records, and they're all different, and they're all fantastic, but they all have this thread. They all sound like Chick, even if he's doing complete, he's playing with Bela Fleck, or he's playing with Return to Forever, electric music, acoustic music, Gary Burton, whatever it is, it always sounds like him, but every project is different. And that's kind of something I'd like to be able to do,
Yep.
I was wondering, did you go to Berkeley straight out of high school, or did you have...
Yeah.
So was your training classical, or were you already into jazz at the age of 9, or whatever?
I was playing piano as a young child, but I didn't know what style it was. It was probably a mixture of things, just improvising and writing my own songs. Maybe they were sort of pop songs, and I was writing some classical stuff, trying to emulate Chopin or whatever I was hearing, or Bach, and then I started studying classically with a teacher when I was 15, and then during my year at Berkeley, I had a classical teacher there as well named Ed Bednar, and so but I was a terrible classical pianist. I appreciate the music, and I love it. I love listening to it played well, Martha Argerich or Sokolov, these guys like that. Or Yefim Bronfman or whoever. I love hearing it played well. I just don't think I could ever do it. I got a chance to meet Martha Argerich one time in Verbier Festival in Switzerland. I went to see her play, and I did a solo piano record about 12 years ago called 01, and I improvised a song on there called Wild Card and dedicated it to her, because it was like a improvisation of her, the feeling I get listening to her play. The way Martha plays is like, she'll play Chopin, but it doesn't sound, it gets completely off the page. You don't hear the notes, you just hear like emotions and weather, and it's just amazing, right? So I improvised something with that kind of feeling, and I went backstage to meet her. This is like one of the world's greatest classical pianists to ever walk the earth. And I went to meet her, and I handed her my CD. I said, Miss Argerich, I'm a big fan of yours, and I dedicated this song to you on my record. And she goes, oh, jazz, I wish I could improvise. I'm like, you better not. Because if you do, we're all out of a job. Yeah.
There's another question.
Speaking of women, the pianists, I've heard all men, you talk about all men, male jazz pianists. Who do you listen to, who you like, who's up and coming?
First of all, I don't distinguish between male and female musicians. There's just musicians. But if I had to...
I just happen to hear a lack of women names.
Yeah. I don't know. I've never been asked that before. I like Helen Sung a lot, Jerry Allen. Historically, I had to do I was hired to do to play Mary Lou Williams in a concert with Lincoln Center with Wynton Marsalis. And for whatever reason, Wynton Marsalis thinks that I'm good at playing stride piano. So he assigned me like the early Mary Lou Williams stuff, and it was blazing. I mean, it was just like really, really hard. And I did my best to learn her, her parts. There's this tune called Nightlife, blazing stride piano piece. Yeah, I don't know. I don't look at it as male or female musicians really though.
There've been some good
composers. Maria Schneider is one of my favorite composers of all. I mean, her music just when I get to, she's one of the few people. It's almost like I got to play in her band in Peru when I met in 2004 when I met the Peruvian musicians that became part of my Afro-Peruvian project. But we were playing with a big band of half Peruvian musicians and half North American musicians, and she was conducting. We did a bunch of her music, and I felt, and then I've subbed in her band a couple of times, over the years, and I just felt this is one person who I could completely lose myself in this music and I could just play her music for the rest of my life. I don't even have to do my own thing. This music is so good. You know what I mean? That's how I feel.
But she has very loyal side
Oh yeah,
people.
yeah.
I think Frank Kimbrough's been there
No,
forever.
Frank, I'd have to have him assassinated or something. So I would never do that. I'm sorry.
I was going to say there've been some very.
Been watching Breaking Bad too much. I'm sorry.
There've been some very good female pianists in previous festivals. I think Helen Sung was here last year, and was it the year before? Myra Melford was here. But they're out there. One that was unfamiliar to me I heard recently is Chris Davis, who's in a more avant-garde style, but is playing in New York, and we could rattle off other names, I'm sure.
Anybody heard Jessica Williams' new record?
No, I have not. She had been ill and hadn't played for a while, if I'm not mistaken, and had just recorded again. But she's a great pianist who's been around for a long time, primarily on the West Coast. So.
I just saw Joanne recently in New York. She was wonderful.
Any other questions before we take our dinner break? Okay. Well, pleasure as always.
No, thanks for having me.
And
thanks for coming, you guys.
I'm sure everyone will be back here at 8 o'clock this evening to hear Jeff play solo and trio, which was great. He saved me a question because I knew that the new solo piano album is really fantastic, and it's got a great mix of material. Bjork, I think.
Not on this one, but we do Rush, the Canadian band. Peter Gabriel. In fact, Peter Gabriel. I did this tune of his called "Come Talk to Me," and I did a few videos on YouTube playing the songs on the record, and he somehow found out about it and reposted the video on his own page, and said something really complimentary. It was from him, signed it PG, and. He said something like, if you like improvised jazz piano, check out this cool version of my tune. And I was blown away. And actually my hits on YouTube went from like 17 hits, and that includes the 12 times that I was hitting like reload, to like 17,000 overnight. It just blew up, But it's really, to get that kind of acknowledgement from the composer. He's someone I love his music, so that was really, really nice.
And in addition, a lot of original music. Donald Brown tune, I believe.
Donald Brown.
Yeah. It's a great album. Heart of the Piano, as you said.
Yeah, I called it that because, well, for two reasons. Because the heart, it's where my heart is. This is acoustic. I've played a lot of different kinds of gigs, and you may have seen me with Christian McBride's band playing racks of keyboards and all that kind of stuff. This is always where home base for me. This instrument, when I sit down in front of it, it's really where my heart is. First and foremost, but I also kind of called it that to sort of poke fun at sometimes musicians, take themselves a little too seriously, and they title their albums "The Art of This" or "The Art of That," and as if that record is the defining document for that entire instrument, And I just thought that's kind of silly. I wouldn't want to do that. So,
Well, we'll get one definition of what the piano's about tonight, and so we'll see everybody at 8. And I'll be back here tomorrow at 5:30 doing my final Meet the Artist session of this festival with Warren Wolf. And then Saturday at 5:30, we're going to do our annual listening session up in the gallery. And the album this year is Benny Golson's New York Scene. So that's going to be at 5:30 in the gallery. So see everybody tomorrow, see everybody tonight, and see everybody Saturday. Thanks
Thanks for coming.